Ethan Lewis had never considered his life extraordinary, but he liked the predictability of it. At 26, he had arranged his days into a quiet rhythm: morning coffee, freelance graphic design, a walk through the neighborhood, and evening calls with his boyfriend, Daniel Carter. Their relationship had lasted 3 steady years, built on patience, shared plans, and an unspoken understanding that neither of them was perfect, but they were good together. Or at least, that was what Ethan kept telling himself. Lately, Daniel felt more like a scheduled obligation than a warm presence. He was busier than ever at the accounting firm, often ending their calls early with the same sentence: "I'll talk to you tomorrow. I'm exhausted." Ethan always replied, "It's okay, get some rest," but the disconnect lodged itself in the quiet spaces of his day. He missed the version of Daniel who used to ask how he felt, not just how work was going. Everything shifted the week Lucas Hayes stepped into the apartment. Lucas arrived with nothing but a duffel bag and an apologetic smile, explaining that his old place had flooded and he needed a temporary room. Ethan had agreed without much thought. Helping someone in a crisis felt like the right thing to do. But he hadn't anticipated how quickly Lucas would fill the space with effortless charm. Lucas was 27, a marketing consultant who radiated a natural confidence, the kind that made strangers open up within minutes. Where Ethan was quiet, Lucas was expressive. Where Ethan moved gently through the world, Lucas stormed through it with energy and warmth. Yet somehow, their personalities didn't clash. They balanced it. In the early days, their conversations stayed on the surface: rent, groceries, Wi-Fi passwords. But gradually, Lucas invited depth into the mundane. He asked questions that weren't routine: what inspires your art? What kind of life do you imagine 5 years from now? What's the one thing you've always wanted to do but never found the courage for? Daniel had never asked those kinds of questions. Not recently, anyway. Ethan felt guilty every time he enjoyed their conversations, as if he was betraying a promise he hadn't meant to break. He told himself it was harmless. Lucas was only a roommate. A temporary one. Just someone filling a room, not anything more. But the more Ethan tried to control the situation, the more it slipped through his fingers. One late evening, rain tapped relentlessly against the windows, and thunder hummed in the distance. Ethan worked at his desk, trying to finalize a client project, when the apartment suddenly fell into darkness. The storm had taken the power with it. He stepped into the hallway, holding his phone for light, and found Lucas in the living room lighting a candle. "You okay?" Lucas asked, his voice low, steady, almost comforting. "Yeah," Ethan said, though his heartbeat disagreed. Lucas motioned for him to sit. "Come on. No use working through a blackout." They settled onto the floor, cross-legged, with the candle glowing between them. The flickering light softened Lucas's face, making every expression appear warmer, almost tender. They talked about simple things at first: favorite movies, childhood memories, their most embarrassing moments. Ethan found himself laughing easier than he had in months. Then the tone shifted. Lucas asked, "Ethan, are you happy?" The question was so sudden, so direct, that Ethan blinked. "I think so," he said carefully. Lucas studied him, unblinking. "No. I mean, are you happy with Daniel? Or are you holding on because you're afraid to be alone?" Ethan felt the air tighten. He opened his mouth but found no words. No one, not even Daniel, had ever asked him something so precise, so exposed. The room felt smaller, the candle brighter, the silence thicker. He tried to answer. Tried to form a sentence that made emotional sense. Nothing came out. Lucas softened his voice. "You don't have to tell me. I see you, Ethan. Sometimes people stay in places where they don't feel seen." The words landed like a quiet earthquake. Ethan stood abruptly, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. "I should get some sleep," he muttered. Lucas nodded, not pushing, not apologizing, just watching, with a look that suggested he understood more than Ethan wished he did. When Ethan reached his bedroom, he leaned against the door, trembling with a confusion he didn't want. One simple question had cracked open a truth he wasn't ready to face, and as he lay in the dark, listening to the storm outside, he realized something unsettling: nothing in his life felt certain anymore. The morning after our secret began, nothing outwardly changed, yet everything felt different. The hostel corridors echoed with the same noise, the cafeteria served the same lukewarm meals, and lectures dragged with their usual monotony. But beneath the surface of routine, I carried the knowledge of what Adrian and I had done, a secret so heavy it seemed to bend the air around me. Every glance between us risked exposure, every shared silence threatened to give us away. At first, Adrian acted as though nothing had happened. He greeted me with the same ease, laughed at the same jokes, and joined me at meals as if our lives had not been altered in the stillness of my room. But when we were alone, his mask slipped. His eyes lingered too long, his hand brushed mine too deliberately, his presence filling the small space with a tension that words could not dissolve, and then Michael arrived. His visit was unannounced, catching both of us off guard. I saw him for the first time in the hostel courtyard, a tall, bright-eyed young man with the kind of warmth that explained why Adrian had fallen for him in the first place. He carried a bouquet of cheap flowers, grinning as he spotted Adrian across the yard. They embraced, and I stood at a distance, invisible in the crowd, my chest hollowing at the sight. That evening, Adrian and Michael sat together in the mess hall, talking in low voices, shoulders pressed close. I forced myself not to stare, though every fiber of me burned with jealousy. Watching them was unbearable, not because of the affection they shared, but because I knew what Adrian had hidden from him. I was the secret between them, the fracture in their trust. Later, when Michael had left, I confronted Adrian in my room. "What are we doing?" I asked, my voice raw. "What does any of this mean if you can smile at him as though nothing is wrong?" Adrian's expression hardened, then softened into something far more complicated. "I don't know," he admitted. "I love him, Daniel. I always have. But I can't deny what I feel when I'm with you. It's different, lighter, freer. You make me feel seen in ways he doesn't." His honesty cut deeper than any denial could have. I wanted to be enough, wanted to believe that what we shared could outweigh his history with Michael. Yet I knew, deep down, that I was a shadow in his story, not the light that I. In the days that followed, the distance between us grew. We still exchanged looks, still found excuses to linger near one another, but the intensity had dulled into something more fragile, edged with guilt. I began to realize that what we had built was not sustainable. Infidelity had given me a taste of what I craved, but it came poisoned with shame. The hostel no longer felt like home. The same walls that had once given us privacy now pressed in on me, suffocating with memories. I started spending more time in the library, avoiding the spaces where Adrian and I had once found comfort. He noticed, of course, but neither of us had the courage to name what was happening. Graduation arrived sooner than I expected. On the last night in the hostel, Adrian and I stood together in the dim corridor between our two rooms, the air thick with unspoken words. He reached for my hand, holding it tightly, as though trying to etch the memory into his skin. "I don't regret us," he whispered. "Even if I should." Neither did I, though regret was tangled through my heart like ivy. I nodded, unable to speak, and then let his hand slip from mine. That was the last night we stood together in that way. Years later, I still think of those rooms, two separate spaces side by side, divided by walls that could not contain what grew between us. I remember the laughter, the confessions, the storm, the kiss, and the choices that followed. And I remember the lesson, carved deep and enduring: desire may burn bright in secrecy, but it cannot sustain itself without truth. In the end, we both had a separate room in the hostel, but in crossing into each other's, we lost the room in our hearts for honesty. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of quiet companionship. Adrian and I grew inseparable, our doors swinging open as though hinges no longer mattered. Meals were shared, study notes exchanged, and the silence of midnight hours filled with conversations that left us more entangled than either of us dared to admit. The hostel had hundreds of boys, yet it often felt like Adrian and I lived in a world apart, divided from the rest by invisible walls. But beneath the comfort of routine, unease grew. I caught myself watching him too long, memorizing the curve of his smile or the sound of his laughter. Each glance carried a weight I could no longer deny. And though I told myself to step back, to reclaim the distance we had so easily discarded, I found it impossible. Adrian had become a gravitational pull, and I was helplessly caught in his orbit. The conflict within me sharpened whenever Michael's name appeared. Adrian would occasionally mention him, never with enthusiasm, never with the warmth I expected from someone speaking of love. Once, when his phone rang during dinner, I noticed the name glowing on his screen. He silenced it, muttering something about bad timing, and continued eating as though nothing had happened. I said nothing, but my chest tightened with a mix of curiosity and guilt. Why was he ignoring the man he claimed to love? One evening, we lingered in my room long after most lights in the hostel had gone dark. Our books lay forgotten on the desk, and we sat cross-legged on the floor, speaking in low tones. Adrian confessed that he often felt misunderstood, that Michael expected things from him he could not always give. His words were steady, but his eyes betrayed a vulnerability he rarely allowed others to see. I wanted to comfort him, to say something meaningful, but all I managed was silence. In that silence, I realized my role was shifting. I was no longer just his friend. I was becoming his confidant, the one who knew the cracks in his carefully constructed armor. Guilt gnawed at me. I should have set boundaries, should have reminded him of the man waiting for him elsewhere. Yet the truth was crueler. I didn't want to. I wanted to be the one he turned to, the one who filled the void Michael seemed unable to reach. Each word he spoke deepened my longing and eroded my resolve. The night of confession came quietly, almost tenderly. We had been arguing over something trivial, whether he should reconcile with Michael or demand more honesty from him. I had spoken with unusual sharpness, frustration boiling over, not at Michael but at the invisible tether that bound Adrian away from me. He fell silent, staring at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. And then, without warning, he leaned forward and pressed his lips against mine. The kiss was brief but electric, shattering the fragile wall I had clung to for weeks. When he pulled away, the air between us seemed charged, the silence deafening. My heart pounded as I searched his face for regret, but all I saw was confusion, confusion that mirrored my own. We sat there, eyes locked, caught between desire and dread. Neither of us spoke of it the next day. Yet the current between us had shifted irreversibly. Every word, every gesture carried the echo of that moment. And though we tried to pretend otherwise, the truth hovered like a storm cloud. We had crossed a line. That night, Adrian returned to my room. There were no excuses this time, no pretense of study or conversation. He closed the door softly behind him, and in the quiet that followed, we gave in to what we had both been resisting. The weight of secrecy pressed down on me even as I felt the exhilaration of closeness I had long imagined. It was everything I had wanted, and everything I feared. When dawn broke, the world outside continued as though nothing had changed. Boys shouted in the corridor, breakfast smells drifted from the mess hall, and life resumed its predictable rhythm. But for me, nothing was the same. I lay awake long after Adrian slipped back into his own room, replaying every detail, every breath. The thrill was intoxicating, but beneath it lurked a shadow I could not ignore, that we had betrayed someone who trusted him, someone who deserved honesty. I had stepped willingly into the role of the intruder, the secret. The thought should have filled me with shame, but instead, it left me torn, between guilt and the dangerous sweetness of having what I had silently desired. And as I stared at the ceiling, I knew with painful clarity, the path ahead would not be simple. What had begun with a knock on the door had become something neither of us could control.